Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited. This is my first NACIS, and it's awesome to get to present right after Rudo because his work is so amazing, and I think our two presentations really speak to each other today. So a lot of the questions that folks were asking Rudo, hopefully I can also speak to in this presentation. And I think the work that Rudo just shared is a really good example of what Indigenous data sovereignty looks like in practice, which we'll talk about more in this presentation. So I want to first just briefly introduce myself. I know that Megan shared a little bit about me. I am an Indigenous cartographer. I'm a Cheyenne descendant. I'm joining from Wiyot territory today, which is in Northwestern California. I wanted to kind of ground myself in that so that you know the peoples that I'm accountable to and the land that I'm on. I also want to share that the presentation I'm giving today is based on an article that was published in Cartographica a couple weeks ago. So I'm sure the article is much more eloquent than I will be today. So if you're interested in getting kind of the full version of these ideas, I would recommend checking that article out. And if there's anybody who doesn't have institutional access who wants to read it, just reach out to me and I will make sure that you get access. So today I'm talking about spatial data and decolonization and how to incorporate Indigenous data sovereignty principles into cartographic research. Also, one last note before we go forward, due to the pandemic, am joining from home as many of us are today. You may hear my dogs in the background. I apologize in advance. My puppy thinks every Zoom call is for her, which has been fun for the last 8 months. So I came to the ideas for this presentation and the article that it comes from, in part from a visit to the Camp to Protect Mauna Kea last year. For those who aren't familiar with the context around why that camp was put into place, Mauna Kea is a sacred site to Kanaka Native Hawaiian people. Mauna Kea has been repeatedly desecrated by the construction of large telescopes. And there's an additional telescope that was slated to be built on the mountain and would further desecrate that sacred site even more. And so Kanaka people, as part of a decades-long struggle to protect the mountain, actually set up an encampment to halt construction or prevent construction. So that's the photo that you're seeing here is a small portion of the camp. And this is not a photo I took. I actually didn't take any photos at the camp because I didn't feel like as a non-Hawaiian person that it was appropriate for me since we were there to protect a sacred site. But I wanted to give you a little sense of what it looked like and how beautiful the Mauna is. The reason that this visit was so influential for me in thinking about these ideas was because the camp had a really beautiful practice of doing protocol daily and sometimes multiple times a day. And so, you know, without going into specifics about Hawaiian protocols in specific, because again, I'm not Hawaiian, I want to share today kind of a broader concept of Indigenous ideas of protocol and diplomacy and how that might inform the research that we do and the work that we do with Indigenous communities. So as part of the camp, there was visitors coming in constantly, new people to join the camp or visitors just coming to stand in solidarity. And in order to be there, you were expected to go through protocol, which entailed sharing songs, dances, or any kind of introduction that's meaningful from your own culture and the place that you come from, and asking permission from the elders of the camp and the cultural leaders there for you to be there and for you to support their movement. And I can say the protocols that I witnessed and took part in were absolutely beautiful. It definitely left a long-lasting impact on me, both as an Indigenous scholar and just as a community member. They had folks from all over different Pacific Islander and Polynesian communities, as well as Indigenous folks from North America, which was really neat. Even the opportunity to participate in protocol myself. The sister that I was there with, we offered one of our songs and some of our jewelry and some berry soup for the camp. And it was just really special. I feel like special isn't even the right word because it's so much more than that. It got me thinking though, if this kind of practice of asking for permission to be in a place and to support a community could be so beautiful in this context, why is it so ugly in an institutional context? I think most of us who have been through the IRB or HSR process know that it's really just kind of an inconvenience designed to protect the institution rather than to actually protect research subjects and the communities that we work with. So how is it that a process that's meant to be around ethics and consent is actually really ugly when here there's this beautiful model of diplomacy that could be used instead or could be incorporated into the IRB or HSR process. The other thing I want to say about the camp and the movement to protect the Mauna is that that movement has largely been conceived as like anti-science because it's in opposition to a telescope. And what I experienced at the camp is that there was science pervading every single activity of every day, whether it was in classes at the university that was set up there at camp, or even just in the teachings shared in protocol or in other conversations. Kanaka Maoli people have a really rich history of ancestral science that's very much accurate and in line with many of the things that Western science had to kind of catch up to, whether it's astronomy or plant medicine or even the fundamental idea that we're primarily made up of water and come from water. That's something that Native Hawaiian people knew for millennia before colonization. So Native Hawaiian culture is not anti-science, it's actually deeply scientific. So experiencing those dual conversations in this space inspired me to think about what if we thought of all Indigenous cultures as inherently scientific? What if we thought of our protocols and our diplomacy as a teaching for the way that we approach ethics in geography and cartography-based research? So I want to start just by briefly going over how things have gone wrong. I think a lot of people see cartography as inherently colonial, and that's not the case. But it has been utilized as a colonial weapon, whether it's in land dispossession, which I think most people would be familiar with, things like the Dawes Act, where Indigenous territories were transitioned from communal to individual plots, and then most of those plots were given to white folks. Maps that facilitated genocide and massacres, maps that facilitated violent colonial borders. For example, the border between the US and Canada was entirely couched in spatial science and cartography, and split families and communities. Cartography and its role in concentration camps and apartheid. I know that seems like strong language, but reservations and reserves throughout the continent started out as concentration camps. That's really what they were. You were not allowed to leave without permission. You were expected to work for rations. Sexual violence was rampant, disease was rampant. There's actually documentation that Hitler's concentration camps were modeled on reservations in the US. And now today that's created a lasting system of kind of unofficial apartheid, where Indigenous communities are seen as kind of a whole other world. And even our people today, for example, a common experience for undergraduate students who are Indigenous is to be told to go back to the res, right? Because they don't belong off of the reservation. More largely, cartography and cartographers are implicated in a kind of scientific racism that says that Indigenous people don't have spatial awareness or aren't capable of making scientifically accurate maps. I don't want to dwell on that today. There is another article that I've written called Indians Don't Make Maps, which debunks all of that. And then there's a larger issue with cartography and academic exploitation. Academic researchers going into Indigenous communities and mapping all the wrong things in all the wrong ways as a way to build their own career. So how could it be different? I want to introduce the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty. There's a list here of different Indigenous groups that are focused on Indigenous data sovereignty efforts. These are all very readily accessible. They all have websites. I would definitely encourage anyone who wants to learn more to reach out to them. There's also a fabulous edited collection that's available free for download called Indigenous Data Sovereignty. Essentially what Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to have authority over information about them and their homelands. And what I mean by have authority is have control over, have access to, have control over what data is continued to be gathered, have control over how it's used. So from start to finish, Indigenous peoples have ownership and have a right to authority over data about them and their territories and lifeways. A concrete example of this is from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So they build on the FAIR principles, which ask that data be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And then they add the CARE principles on top of that, which stress collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So to return to this idea of Indigenous diplomacy, and then we're going to look at how we're going to combine it with data sovereignty. There's a few examples I give in the paper beyond those at Mauna Kea around Indigenous protocols. It's not something that only happens in special places like the camp at Mauna Kea. It is a part of the daily fabric of Indigenous communities. So the photos you see here are representing the transoceanic voyages from the Polynesian Voyaging Society, canoe journeys, which is an annual event spanning the Pacific Northwest and now California, where Indigenous groups from throughout the coast visit one another by canoe. There's a photo of the late elder Josephine Mandamin, who started the water walks, which was to honor and protect water. And she walked along the Great Lakes to connect her peoples of the Great Lakes. And then the other photo you see here, unfortunately, it is from the Canadian government, which I'm not thrilled about. But basically the idea, those are all Indigenous words for welcome. And so even something as day-to-day as introducing ourselves in our traditional way, whether it's with language or saying our clans or our grandparents or the place that we come from, that's also part of our daily protocol. So I want to ask, how does our research as geographers and cartographers change when we shift our perspective from one characterized by the academic and institutional expectation of Indigenous consent to one grounded in Indigenous data sovereignty? So how do we go from a model of the expectation of the ability to take to a model that stresses giving? So I have a four-part 13-point plan. First part, be respectful. Respect the protocols of the community you're going to. Don't travel to an Indigenous community for mapping-based research if you aren't willing to connect with the land in a way that they're comfortable with. So that may mean not gathering specific plants, or not going to certain places, or dressing a certain way if you are going to go to that place, or putting a certain tradition into practice when you do gather, anything like that. And understand that you may be asked to create maps that are not for public distribution and that may never be allowed to be published. And consider that to be a really exciting moment that shows that they really trust you. and invest in that trust, invest in that relationship. As Rudo mentioned, there's some data that's just not appropriate for public distribution, at least without express permission. And that's something that we have to honor. Part 2, be aware. Don't go to an Indigenous community and to do work with them without extensively researching the history and ongoing legacies of colonization as it affects that specific community. So it's not enough to say, oh, I read a book about colonization in Canada. You need to research that actual community, because you should not be going there with the expectation that they're going to teach you about the violence they've experienced, like a whole 300 years of it. Be willing to acknowledge that open source mapping platforms could compromise the community's data sovereignty. Sometimes they want to use those platforms. Sometimes that is the most appropriate option, but they need to make that decision for themselves, and they need to make that an informed decision. And understand that the community has a fundamental right to own the data on its land and people. Just because you gather that data or help them map it doesn't mean it belongs to you. Point 3, be humble. And I'm speeding through this because of limitations on time. Don't assume that the community you're intending to map doesn't already have cartographers. That's something I run into constantly. I'm asked constantly for use of our data at Sovereign Bodies Institute for the purposes of mapping, with a presumption that we couldn't possibly do that for ourselves, which is laughable because I've been a cartographer for 10 years and am getting my PhD in geography. So please don't make that assumption. If you're coming to map any of our stories or knowledge, you have a responsibility to develop the cultural and technical competency to do that. If you don't have that competency, or if you don't know how to develop it, you are not the right person for this project, point blank. Do not assume that GIS or other Western styles of mapping are useful or desirable. Sometimes they are. Sometimes, especially if there's a legal battle, it is the best option. But again, that needs to be a choice made by the community. And don't expect an academic publication out of a collaboration with an Indigenous community. That's something that you should be upfront about and ask permission for. And if you do have permission, list that community as a co-author. Don't just thank them in the acknowledgements. They should be co-authors. And the last point is be helpful. Don't solicit Indigenous people to participate in a project they didn't ask for. Create opportunities for that community to create their own capacity to continue making maps, whether it's through technical training, equipment and software, taking in community interns who can learn how to lead projects like this. That's something, there should be a long-term investment there. And lastly, work to circumnavigate and remove institutional barriers that make it difficult to put these things into practice. So whether it's an IRB process that doesn't really mesh with these ideals, or funding constraints or time constraints on researchers, those are things that we should be using our privilege to work to change. Why is this so important? I want to stress that I am not saying that non-Indigenous people should not be doing this work with Indigenous communities. What I am saying is that it should be done in the right ways. And when it is done in the right ways, there's powerful things that come out of that. It's incredibly important to have meaningful dialogue about land and places of significance. And as I've written on this slide, I think it's one of the most literal paths to decolonization because of the critical conversations that it opens up about land, power, and violence. And it requires an actively decolonizing framework that centers Indigenous political sovereignty, land title, and self-determination. So I want to close with this quote from the paper. Cartography grounded in Indigenous data sovereignty becomes a means of charting a decolonized future. So that's the ultimate takeaway from all of this. A decolonized future is going to need all of us to pull off, and this kind of process can lead us to that. But it has to be done in a good way in order to make that happen. So I've tried to offer some concrete ways that folks can think through how to do this work in a good way, with the hope that these conversations can flourish and folks aren't feeling so um, afraid to engage in these conversations or this process because they don't know how to do it or don't know where to start. So I realize I've used up all of my time. So I probably don't have time for questions today, but if there's anybody who wants to reach out with questions, please do shoot me an email. My email is anitaluchesi@gmail.com. I would love to talk about this more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annita. I feel like your presentation kind of at the end really just encapsulates like what we can all do and actually push, you know, decolonized futures and just more equitable futures forward. And mapping, I strongly believe, plays an important role in that. And so anyways, thank you for ending our session. I want to thank all of our speakers. Definitely feel free to follow up with any of our speakers. Their contact information I put in the chat, but also, of course, feel free, a simple Google search, you can typically find these folks. And so anyways, with that, I want to thank everyone. I hope this session really kind of pushes cartographers outside of our conventional notions of our practices. And so with that, thanks, and we'll see you all next year, hopefully.